Dr. Wanda Wyporska, thank you ever so much for joining us all on this special HistFest lockdown event. You and I I don't think we've actually spoken face to face before, but we've been in communication with each other a lot about primarily witches, because it's one of my absolute favourite topics. And I'm a fan, I'm a witch fan. I'm not an expert, but you are a proper expert when it comes to witchcraft. So I wanted to chat to you about the history of witchcraft during the early modern period. So first of all, I mean, what happened in Europe during the early modern period for this witch craze to take off?
Well, I mean, that's a huge question, isn't it? 3 or 4 centuries worth of European history in a quick potted version. I think primarily, if anybody's looking for one reason why the witchcraft, I would say epidemic in these times rather than craze happened, then they're barking up the wrong tree. There are so many different reasons why trials took off in different places at different times, and over those 300 or 400 years the crime of witchcraft itself very much changed. But I think 3 basic things are obviously the papal bull in 1498, which set up witchcraft as a crime. We'd obviously had witchcraft trials in ecclesiastical courts before that, but that really sort of was a catalyst for the trials to start across Europe. And I think it's really looking at the context of the religion, the emphasis on dogma within religion, the legislation, the increase in legislating for behaviour. For the first time, really, people were being able to be criminalised because of their behaviour and what was deemed right and wrong. And in an effort, really, when we're trying to set up what the orthodoxy is, we then have to define it against what the other is. And so this is a perfect example of how we create the other, how we create our own religiosity or our own communities by saying, oh, and these people are the other. So the dynamics of religion, the dynamics of warfare, epidemics, a whole range of weather as well, all of these things created conditions under which, if you had a dynamic of power where you could accuse somebody of something and, let's face it, you can really prove it, then this was a perfect mechanism for bringing cases of witchcraft against people.
Did it differ from place to place? Were the differences in the way that it was treated within Catholic countries as opposed to Protestant countries? I mean, what can you say about that?
I think because we're seeing more and more cases and more histories from different countries. So predominantly, we'd seen a lot from Germany, a lot from France, a lot from Western Europe. And so religion, it was very much saying, well, it seemed to happen more in Catholic places in Germany. But I think the more we see different countries, the more we see that there weren't necessarily more cases in a Catholic country than in a Protestant country. And also, if you take different countries, they were going through different parts of the Reformation at different times as well. I mean, Poland, that I studied, had a very, very strong counter-Reformation. But I think if you look at places like Estonia, Russia, you see that predominantly men were accused, Hungary as well, and accusations could have been more shamanic. Even if you take England, or if you take Scotland, or if you take France, then you see that cases varied and outbreaks varied from city to city, from village to village. So there's very little sort of way of saying, oh, this particular thing happened here, because a lot of this was about the politics of the village or the politics of what was going on at the time as well. So as I keep coming back to the point that, if you ever buy a book or listen to a talk by someone who says this was the reason for witchcraft, then I'd want your money back.
So it was almost used in different places as a mechanism to target people that may have been causing problems. Would that be a fair comment to make, or not?
Well, I think it's all about the power dynamics. I mean, I studied about 300 trials for my work, and what really struck me was it was like a retrospective journalism. It was going back into people's lives, and one such case, the miller's wife had lost her husband, and then she took over the mill, and then the owner put the rent up, and she complained, and then the owner started accusing her of witchcraft. You know, it's all these little stories. Anyone who's ever lived in a village or lived in, you know, a very small community knows how these relationships play out. And if you have a mechanism whereby you have some power and you can accuse somebody else, and you just really need to get, you know, some of your mates to say, oh yeah, you know, my cow twisted its leg last week and it's all her fault, then you can see how this can be used. And when we look at, it's not just, you know, at the village level. If you look at, obviously, many queens and many women in power were accused of witchcraft, or, you know, people like John Dee, people who were, there's a wide range of people against whom you could accuse of witchcraft. So, you know, right from the village, sort of perhaps wise woman or somebody in the village that you didn't really like, right up to, you know, people like obviously Joan of Arc or Eleanor of Aquitaine, Catherine de Medici. Women in particular in power were often rumoured or accused of witchcraft.
As a useful slight to you know, to use against women, powerful women at that time, well, during the early modern period as well. And about a year or so ago, well, actually 2 years ago now, not that the timing matters whatsoever, but I was doing a bit of research in our hometown, because you're from Chester as well, which is amazing.
I am indeed.
In the house. And I found a document, and it was a typed up document from other records, just saying that women accused of witchcraft had been executed by Chester Castle. And it just made me think this was really widespread. So I just wondered, you as a historian of this very specific topic, does it get hard researching when you're going through these documents properly and, you know, reading these cases? Is it troublesome?
It is. I mean, I think it's, you know, I think the fact that before I did my doctorate, did a lot of journalism. I'm just naturally nosy. I like to know people's business. And when I was reading through the trials, it's going back into people's lives. It's very, very tragic, because we know how these things end. I mean, the research I did on Poland, with my cases, there was an execution rate of about 95%, which is very high. And I had cases of daughters accusing mothers, mothers accusing daughters, you know, young children, of all sorts of issues where, you know, you could see there'd been abuse in the family, and the whole range and gamut of human experience is in those cases. And it is really tragic, because when you've got the richness of a case that has maybe 20 or 30 pages, and that's absolutely fantastic when you get a trial that's got that much detail, you get really involved with the characters. You get really involved, well, they're not characters, you know, they were real women and real men. You get involved in their lives, and you know from the start almost how it's going to end, and it's very, very tragic. And it is, you know, you try to keep that distance, but going through. And when you do get a case where they're released, you know, it's a real moment of, oh, great, you know. But then you have to face the fact that, you know, they may have been released, but 5 or 10 years later, or a couple of years later, they may have been accused again, because, you know, once the taint of witchcraft was there, it was very difficult to get rid of it. So it's really hard.
I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, but I was going to ask you if you could, in as brief a way as possible, walk us through one of the trials that you've investigated, just so that we can get a sense of how these things progressed. So if that's possible for you to do.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned, when I give talks on this, I always start by reading part of a trial. And the trial that I usually use is from the 17th century, where a 12-year-old girl is talking about how she's been to the Sabbat and how she's lain with the devil. And, you know, how she faces her mother, and her mother says to her mother, oh, you're not really my mother, you know, I hate you anyway. I mean, I think most of us as kids have probably said these things to our parents, but in that context, it's really, you know, it is a death sentence. And so she's testifying against her mother and saying, you never taught me the Our Father, you didn't do the things you were supposed to do as a mother. And so they're facing each other, and you see, because then the mother is interviewed as well. And they go through sort of 2 rounds of torture. And there are other witnesses brought to sort of defame their character. And then what happens when you bring witnesses is they will then start accusing each other. So it becomes a little bit exponential. And the more people that you bring in, the more, you know, I mean, I'm sure if I were in that situation, I'd start accusing people, you know, if they were accusing me as well. And so these women then, and the men that are there, then are stuck in this judicial system. They're being tortured. They're giving a testimony which is being written down and then used against them. And then they come to court, and the case is open and shut, and they're judged there by, you know, the men sitting at the table. And very often what I've noticed in the cases is that, you know, we look at the more educated men there, and the way that they regard the women and their language and how they behave and their lives, because they are generally poorer women, provides that other barrier as well, because they're judging them on their class and on where they're from as well. So you can see these dynamics in the cases, and then we know what happens after that.
It must be really traumatic to read through these things. And I mean, I spent some time looking at the Great Plague, and you know, with that may stay with you. And even now I could recall entire families in entire parishes in London that perished due to the Great Plague. I'm sure you have all these names and all of these men and women in your mind a lot of the time. I guess my next question is about the way witches, the belief about witches. I mean, what were witches capable of doing for those who believed that they were true, and how could they be countered? I mean, the stories of them needing to have drawn and things that in English cases, but I wonder if you could talk about some of the what we would think of as oddities when it comes to witchcraft belief during the early modern period.
Yeah, I think it's really essential, and this is where a lot of historians go wrong, is to realise that these beliefs were very real at that period. That, you know, we have to sort of strip off our mask of modernity and say, oh, look, you know, this was all a bit superstitious, and how could they possibly believe that? But to realise they were living within such a religious environment, that they very often did believe a lot of these things. And it's really interesting because at the start of the trials, being a witch, or being subjected to an accusation of being a witch, which is a different thing, was really about using magical properties. So it may have been blessing a cow with some holy water or some herbs, or repeating a mantra, repeating parts of a prayer. And we find, funnily enough, that the wording used is the same. I found it the same in Polish trials, in German trials, in some French trials as well. So there's a recognised set of practices there. And in a way, that's about women in particular taking the power, the male power of the church, and that's seen as a threat. Well, as we move through the period, then the trials become about meeting the devil, attending the Sabbath, having sex with the devil, and a whole range of collective practices. So at the beginning, it's about the sort of soul witch. As we move through the period, it becomes about collective meetings, and it becomes about diabolism, and it becomes about you know, meeting the devil, having sex with the devil, and also using different rituals. So it very much shifts. And one of the things that I always bring out, and you know, sometimes I get a bit of criticism for this, but you know, the evidence is there, is that this wasn't just women. You know, up to about 25-26% of those who were accused or executed were men. So, you know, we have to move away from this idea that it was wise women, and it was, you know, it was women who were midwives, and it could be anybody, basically. And again, I come back to power dynamics. You know, it was about where the power was and how it was used.
That's what I was going to ask you as well, about whether there is a witch archetype. But you clearly, you know, from what you've just said, there is no archetype. Perhaps, you know, from in different places there might be, but overall, it could be anybody. Would you say that's fair?
I think so, because I think, you know, my reading of it is that this is about how you use power. And when I looked at my trials in Poland, I found that the vast majority of women who were accused were servants. So they were in a very precarious position, being in someone else's household, but being other in that household. You also had accusations of witchcraft thrown at in relation to sodomy as well. That was very much included, where men were accused, particularly in my trials in Poland. But there are a range of different ways in which witchcraft sometimes was just added in as an accusation. So some accusations, I have a case against a Jewish man, in which case, you know, there were lots of different accusations going on there in terms of his in terms of his beliefs and practice, but also witchcraft was thrown in there as well. So it's a kind of, in some cases it's an add-on, in other cases it's the main accusation. So, you know, I don't think there's an archetype. I think, again, it comes to power, and how that's evolving.
How did it end? Did it end? I mean, it would have been different in different places, but how did it come to a close? I mean, you've pushed back against the phrase "witch craze," which is fair, but in Europe during the early modern period, what happened to for these cases to start diminishing?
I think I push back against it because, you know, there are all sorts of statistics floating out there. I mean, German feminists estimated 9 million women as a sort of gynocide, and figures have sort of really ranged from those sorts of figures to, I think a more realistic is 50 to 60,000 across that period in terms of executions. So I think it's a persecution rather than a craze. But I think in terms of it ending, there were many different reasons. It would peter out in various places. It was very different in Central Europe, where it carried on for probably, you know, the last case I have is around about 1780s. And of course, there are extrajudicial cases which are not recorded in the courts, where, you know, you might have a local lynching or, you know, other things like that. So it ended in different ways, and it ended earlier in Western Europe. And I think one of the features was the fact that cases were going from villages to the cities to higher courts. And obviously the influence of the Enlightenment, when people were saying, you know, do we really believe that people are actually doing this? Do we believe in the supernatural? The challenges to religion as well. But, you know, if you take somewhere like France, obviously the role of the High Court there was very influential. And so it changed in different jurisdictions, I think, because let's not forget that Europe wasn't the big sort of collection of countries we know now. I mean, in Germany, you had probably over about 280 or more principalities, duchies, different jurisdictions. So it was very much a patchwork of legislative decisions.
This is obviously a hard question to ask any historian, but are there any lessons that can be learned from what happened during this period and this topic that we can carry with us?
Oh, well, absolutely. I mean, I think actually that's probably the easiest question you've given me. Maybe it's just me, but I think, you know, looking at, it's the question of how we other people, how we build our society, on what grounds, who we include, who we don't include. And I think that lesson of othering and scapegoating is one that has, you know, we haven't learned the lessons. We can see that whether you're an early modern historian or you're a historian of the war or you're a historian now of what's happening with COVID, you know, the practice of othering people and building up your own identity on the back of describing what you are and what somebody else is not and what you are not. You know, we haven't learned those lessons. It's really sad to say, and it almost points to a fundamental human need, doesn't it, of belonging. And if we can have that human need of belonging without scapegoating and forming our identities in opposition to other people's, then I think we'd really learn a lesson. But I think we're a long way away from that, unfortunately.
Well, hopefully, maybe the next generation can do that work for us, because it's definitely, as you say, it's there's worrying things that are happening with stigmatization and with the outbreak. But this is historical escapism, so we'll try and keep it historical. We'll try and ignore everything else that's going on around the world right now, just for the afternoon. Thank you, Wanda. This has been a fascinating chat, and hopefully we can do it again sometime, because your research is amazing, and I'm in awe of the stuff that you do. So thank you ever so much for giving up your time today.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's been a real honour, and I just want to say, you know, HistFest is one of my favourite things, and all kudos to you for putting it all together.